Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Heather McDonald is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute and an editor of City Journal. She holds a bachelor's degree from Yale, a master's degree from Cambridge, and a law degree from Stanford. Heather is the author of a number of books, including the best-selling volume, The War on Cops. Her newest book, The Diversity Delusion, How Race and Gender Pandering Corrupt the University and Undermine Our Culture. Heather, welcome.
Thank you, Peter. It's an honor.
Heather, 2015, at your alma mater, Yale University. Here is the sequence of events. The administration sends an email suggesting that the students use caution in choosing their Halloween costumes so as not to offend other students.
Of course.
One lecturer at Yale, a woman called Erica Christakis, sends an email saying that maybe students ought to value the importance of free speech and perhaps push back against the idea that administrators tell them what Halloween costumes to wear. Her husband, Nicholas Christakis, who, by the way, is a very accomplished physician and sociologist, sends an email supporting his wife's position. It happens that he's the master of one of the Yale colleges, Silliman College, and then this is what happens in the courtyard of Silliman College.
The exception is because other people have rights too, not just you.
Walk away. Walk away. He doesn't deserve to be listened to.
Unsafe space here for
I
all.
deny-
Stay quiet. For all standing students. You understand that? As your position as master, it is your job to create a place of comfort and home for the students that live in Silliman. You have not done that. By sending out that email, that goes against your position as master. Do you understand that? Then
No, I don't
stop.
agree with that.
Then why the did you accept the position?
Because
Who
I have
the hired you?
Heather, there we have 19 and 20-year-old students defying the master of a Yale college and telling him that it's his job to create a place of comfort and home. What are we to make of this?
It's the Cultural Revolution. This is the nadir of American education. This sort of insanity, the narcissistic victimology of these students thinking of themselves as oppressed at Yale is the height of delusion. And yet they are a product of the Yale bureaucracy. They are being encouraged in this sort of complete hysteria. Another moment in this 3-hour tirade that was directed at Nicholas Christakis.
We gave it, what was that, 30 seconds
30
of something
seconds.
that lasted for 3 hours.
It gets worse than that. The cursing, the disrespect, it is utterly shocking. One group of students shouted out, "We're dying," allegedly referring to the endangered status of Yale's minority students. The kicker is this: the president of Yale, a little bit after this outrageous episode, conferred a racial justice prize on 2 of the participants and said that he'd never been so proud of his student body in his life.
And promised, if I have this correct, and promised to add $50 million to the diversity budget of the university.
Well, that was actually a promise made before, but he reiterated it just to encourage the notion that Yale was trying to erase discrimination at Yale.
And Nicholas Christakis resigned as master of Silliman College.
And his wife resigned as a teacher at Yale completely because they were the then target of vandalism. There was graffiti on their house. At the graduation that year, students refused to shake his hand. This is completely out of control, Peter. And Yale is not alone.
So 2017, a little more recent incident, Claremont McKenna, where you yourself had been invited to speak.
Yes.
I want to come to the reasons for what on earth is going on first, but first I want to establish what is going on, how bad it is, which I have to say, I thought I had an idea, but the book is shocking. Students, you are invited to speak at Claremont McKenna. Students circulate a statement that reads, I am quoting this because I couldn't make it up. Heather McDonald is a fascist, a white supremacist, a war hawk, a transphobe, a queerphobe, a classist, and ignorant of interlocking systems of domination that produce the lethal conditions under which oppressed peoples are forced to live.
Yes.
Close quote.
They're ignorant of grammar, but we will leave it aside because colleges are not supposed to teach good writing, right? They're simply supposed to teach victim identity.
So what happened to you when you attempted to speak at Claremont?
Well, the students blockaded the auditorium and didn't let anybody in. I had to be brought in under police escort through a back alley through the kitchen, a secret passageway, but nobody else could get in because about 200 students were outside banging on the plate glass windows. I gave my talk, which was on policing and a counter-narrative to the Black Lives Matter nonsense, calumnies against the cops, to an empty room. But the students were still outside banging on the plate glass windows and shouting, and at some point the police decided they couldn't guarantee my safety any longer, and I was escorted out back through the kitchen into a waiting squad car.
Wow. And disciplinary measures against the kids who broke up, who made it impossible effectively for you to speak to the audience? What happened to the kids?
Well, this was unusual in that there was some discipline, a suspension of a semester for a hand, maybe 2 or 3, and a full year suspension for another 2 or 3. Some of the students were from the neighboring Claremont colleges. Claremont itself claims that these were the only Claremont students it could identify. I don't know. I'm not going to second guess them. What I would say, though, is that the faculty are basically passive. They lie down before these things. They should be out there. They've got the privilege of tenure to protect their freedom of speech, not that they use that very much, because, Peter, as you know, any faculty member on a college campus today who is anything other than far left is walking around scared to death. The censorship that's going on is extraordinary.
Including self-censorship is the point you're making now.
Self-censorship. Right. But the faculty are silent before these outbreaks of thuggish, fascist type of behavior.
Right. That's what's happening. How did it happen? How did we reach this point? Let me quote the Diversity Delusion, Heather. A charged set of ideas now dominates higher education. That human beings are defined by their skin color, sex, and sexual preference, and that discrimination based on those characteristics has been the driving force in Western civilization. These ideas have remade the university, close quote. All right, a touch of intellectual history. Where did these ideas come from, and how did they become ascendant?
It's a very complicated question, Peter, and one can observe the trajectory. The final cause question has to be speculative. Mm-hmm. I can tell you that when I was in college in the 70s, I was susceptible to a totally ridiculous set of ideas that were known as deconstruction and post-structuralism. This was a set of theories about how language and literature works. Unfortunately, I was not critical enough. I bought it hook, line, and sinker.
You were 19 years old.
I was 19, and I was interested in language. Nevertheless, I feel very fortunate in that I was allowed to read, when I was a college student at Yale, Chaucer, Milton, Spencer, and Wordsworth without anyone thinking to complain about their gonads and melanin. Feminism and multiculturalism didn't hit. It came in the 80s.
Right.
At Stanford, where you are now, at Hoover, you had the awful moment of the assault on Stanford's very minimal core curriculum, Jesse Jackson in there leading chants of hey, hey, ho, ho, Western Civ has got to go. And you had this geyser explosion of the idea that students should only read books that conform to their own identity, defined as narrowly and trivially as possible.
Heather, distinguish between the student radicalism of the 60s mm-hmm. and what's taking place today. I find in conversation with friends, there's a little too much willingness to shrug the shoulders and say, oh, well, they're just students. We've gotten used to that kind of the place. Universities are a place for a certain amount of craziness, and that's been going on for half a century. But this is different.
Well, it's the same in that, you know, I think the problem with the 60s is one can make a facially plausible argument that there was grounds to protest the Vietnam War. Right. I'm agnostic on that. I'm not going to take a side. But, mm-hmm. but that was an idea that had some validity. So, you know, a broken clock is right twice a day. Every so often, student protesters are right. Usually they're not. Usually they don't deserve any attention. Why should I listen to student protesters about capitalism? They've never had a job. They've never run a business. They know nothing about what it's like to try and master a supply chain, to try and understand supply and demand and customer demands. This is an act of entrepreneurial courage that none of these students have. Nevertheless, in the 60s, we all thought, the students, they are tribunals of truth. And from then on, we glorified student protest. And so when it rose up again in the 80s, around these narrow ideas of student victimization, which again is delusional. There's no more privileged human being in history than a college student because he has at his fingertips the thing that Faust sold his soul for, which is knowledge. We still glorify this and say, well, if students at Yale and Princeton say they're victimized by racism, we better do something about it.
Right, right. The diversity delusion takes up topic after topic after topic. We don't have time for all of them, alas, but here's one, affirmative action. Again, I'm quoting the diversity delusion. This is your argument, strong argument here, a growing body of empirical evidence is undermining the claim that racial preferences in college benefit their recipients. That is to say, affirmative action may not do any good at all anyway.
Right.
Explain your argument.
Absolutely. And this, to me, is the most powerful argument against racial preferences. I'm frankly fed up with the traditional Supreme Court jurisprudence. I think it's incoherent. They should just junk it. The real argument against racial preferences, as far as I'm concerned, is that they harm their alleged beneficiaries. When you put a student in an academic environment for which he is not competitively qualified, you're putting him at a disadvantage. We can take this out of the race realm entirely.
Right.
Let's say that MIT decides it needs to boost its gender parity,
right,
which it is doing all the time when it comes to faculty, and admits me with a 650 on my math SATs on an 800-point scale. Everybody else at MIT, however, has scored 800s. Right. They've gotten a perfect score on their math SATs. What's going to happen to me my first year when I have not aced advanced calculus?
650 is a pretty good score, but you're going to feel stupid.
It's a standard deviation away, and I am going to struggle. I am not going to be able to keep up in those classes.
Right.
And I face two choices. I can either say I was admitted to a school for which I was not prepared, or I'm in a rape culture, and I'm surrounded by microaggressions and patriarchy. And let's move this back into race now. There's not a single selective college in the country, Peter, that is not employing vast racial preferences to admit black students because the skills gap is so great. That's what's driving a lot of this victimology, is students are being brought in, they can't compete, and they end up blaming phantom racism for their intellectual and psychological difficulties.
Heather, you discuss, again, the diversity delusion. You discuss a recent study at Duke. I'm going to quote this. There's a little bit of a setup here, but it's fascinating material. Quote, of incoming students who reported a major, more than 76% of black male freshmen at Duke intended to major in the hard sciences
right.
or economics, hard material. But more than half of those would-be black science majors switched track. They moved from the hard sciences to softer disciplines, humanities, for example, so that by senior year, only 35% of black males graduated with science or economics degrees, while more than 63% of white males did. What is the significance of this?
Well, if you believe what is now the reigning mantra in our society, which is the only good science is diverse science, now I think that's ridiculous, but that's now what's going on. If our goal is to graduate more black scientists, racial preferences work against that goal. If those students who'd been admitted to Duke, the black students, with over a standard deviation of gap in their entering freshman credentials, had gone instead to North Carolina University, a perfectly respectable
yes.
school, for heaven's sakes, where they met the qualifications of their peers, they would stand a much greater chance of graduating in good standing with a science degree. What I find extraordinary about this entire discourse about racial preferences, those who justify it from universities, is its rank snobbery and elitism. The idea is, if you're a black student, you can only succeed if you go to the elite schools. That heaven forbid, you know, in the University of California, the voters, in their wisdom, tried to ban
Prop 209, right?
racial preferences. The university twisted itself into knots to try and evade them. And you would have things like the chancellor of UC Berkeley saying, but where will we get the leaders of tomorrow if we don't have racial preferences? Implying that anybody who graduates from University of California, Riverside, say, or Santa Cruz, his
Which are
life is
actually
over.
very good schools.
His life is over. If it's so inhibiting and handicapping for a black student to go to UC Riverside, why should anybody go? Why don't we close down all these second and third tier schools so everyone can go to Harvard and UC Berkeley?
So, all right. So let me, is this an accurate summary? Many students, we've been discussing African Americans, who are brought in on the basis of racial preferences, do have a charge to make against their universities.
Yes.
They have been brought into institutions in which they cannot succeed with the ease or aplomb of their white counterparts in order to make the overwhelmingly white liberals who run those universities feel good about themselves. They have actually been put at a material disadvantage for the sake of some liberal idiot. Is that right, or have I got it wrong? Am I overstating the case?
No, you have
They
stated
have a reason to be
perfectly.
angry. They have a reason to be angry.
Well, they won't see it this way, but it is a diabolical system. It is now a completely self-perpetuating, it's a perpetual motion machine of grievance. It's uncanny the way the preference regime interacts with the diversity bureaucracy so that you are generating a steady supply of students. You know, there was these wave of Black Lives Matter protests in 2015 on college campuses. Right. Every college issued the demands, and these were collected. You can still find them on the web. What was very odd when I first started reading them, until I figured out what was going on, school after school, these black students are saying, we need more mental health resources. And you thought, really? I mean, what's going on there? But in fact, they feel very stressed out because, again, you hear these complaints about, well, nobody chooses us for study groups. This is attributed, of course, to the bigotry on the white students. The reason is, it's very sad, is, again, you have been admitted to a school for which you're qualified. No one is saying, I am not saying, Peter, that black students should go to college. I'm saying they should go to college on the same footing as everybody else, with a chance to compete against their peers. But now we've got this codependency, this symbiotic relationship between the racial preference so-called beneficiaries and a diversity bureaucracy set up to try and combat the racism that is making them feel uncomfortable at Duke or at Yale or at UC Berkeley.
The campus rape myth. Again, the diversity delusion. Quote, the campus rape industry's central tenet is that 1/5 to 1/4 of all college girls will be raped or become the targets of attempted rape by the end of their college years. No crime, much less one as serious as rape, has a victimization rate remotely approaching 20 or 25%, close quote. Explain.
It's a complete fraud. Detroit is our most violent city. If you combine all 4 of the violent felonies that the FBI collects in its index crime, that's murder, rape, robbery, and aggravated assault, you combine all of those together, you get an annual violent crime rate of 2%. 20% to 1/4, even over 4 years, is more than the worst African civil wars experience in terms of sexual violence. If this were going on, you would have seen a stampede decades ago to get females out of these tsunamis of sexual violence. No mother would send her daughter into a situation of that degree of sexual predation. Instead, the stampede, Peter, as I'm sure you observe at Stanford every year, is the opposite direction. It's highly sophisticated, educated mothers paying $200 an hour when their daughter is 3 years old to try and qualify her for the most elite preschool in order to hope that she gets into Harvard 16 years later. The percentage of females on college campuses grows each year. The the admissions ratios diminish because so many people want to get in. The whole thing is ridiculous. Either, if we're supposed to believe in strong women together and that there's female solidarity, why aren't they warning each other off of these scenes of sexual predation? Instead, you can go to University of Virginia every Saturday night on Rugby Road. The girls are trooping off to the frat parties that the campus rape industry tells us are virtual rape factories, and yet they go every Saturday night. What gives? Either girls are stupid and they are voluntarily walking into these scenes of predation, or it's not going on.
Again, the diversity delusion. The default for premarital sex in the wider society is now yes rather than no. We've had the sexual revolution.
Right.
The policy of mutual consent that these bureaucracies on campus are putting in place may be laughably out of touch with reality, but its agenda is serious to rehabilitate the no as the default position for premarital sex, close quote.
Yep.
So what? So the college, what we see on the colleges is a reaction against the sexual revolution, not that the bureaucracies would ever dream of putting it anything like that way.
Exactly.
Is that so?
Exactly. I mean, I think what's going on is sexual liberation is having a nervous breakdown. It turns out that it made a profoundly incorrect assessment about the male and female libidos. It thought that the female libido was ready to go mano a mano with the male libido, you know, all normative restraints taken away, and that females would celebrate a regime of one-night stand, casual sex, drunken hookup sex, the way the males do, who want to have as much no strings attached sex as possible. They're set up biologically, evolutionarily for that. And it turns out that's not the case. There is not an epidemic of sexual assault and rape on college campuses. There is an epidemic of regret, of feeling taken advantage of feeling like, well, I have some emotional twinge after that one-night stand that females feel. They have a different physiological reaction to sexual intercourse. The guy's off there joking around with his buds, and she's saying, well, why isn't he noticing me in class? And the campus rape bureaucracy then gives you a nice way of repackaging your sense of loss, confusion, embarrassment, regret. It was rape. And before sexual liberation did a number on civilization's eons-long, hard-won understanding of the differences between males and females, the default for premarital sex was set at no.
Right.
That gave females power over the male. The male had to bargain the female out of the no default. Sexual revolution turned that around. The default is now yes, and it's up to the female to argue her way into a no, and that is tough.
And
a
women
lot of
are sick of that.
Yeah, they're sick of it, and they just say, oh, well, it's a lot easier to just say yes than to have to provide reasons why not to have sex. But the weird thing is, you know, the sexual liberation on campuses began with a demand, get the bureaucrats out of our bedroom. We want to have all the coitus we want unsupervised. Now, these same students are asking the bureaucracy to write 40-page, extremely complicated rules for sex, which is the very realm of the chthonic and irrational.
And Heather writes of her fellow conservatives in the Diversity Delusion, conservatives display exasperation at sex regulations for taking the fun out of college sex. Conservatives get this wrong. Yes. In fact, taking the fun out of college sex is the only upside to the whole sordid situation.
That's true. There's no downside. You know, I get and I agree that the campus rape tribunals are kangaroo courts and males are being railroaded. Nevertheless, just as a girl can avoid 100% what is now characterized as campus rape by not drinking herself blotto and getting into bed with a guy she doesn't know and taking off her clothes, a guy can also almost 100% avoid being accused falsely of campus rape by acting with chivalry and as a gentleman. You walk your girlfriend home at night, you kiss her goodnight, and you go home to your own room and you write her a love poem at 2 a.m. There is no downside if this campus rape hysteria and the crusade against males results in a sudden increase in abstinence. It's not as if we're like over-regulating production of natural gas.
I'm going to read this because it may be my favorite quotation in the entire book, which is full of marvelous writing. The solution is not more complex procedural protections cobbled over a sordid sexual culture. The solution is to reject that culture entirely. Society has no interest in preserving the collegiate bacchanal. Should college fornication become a rare event preceded by signing contracts, maybe students would actually do some studying again.
Exactly.
By the way, there must be some special award somewhere for the last unselfconscious use of the word fornication.
I'm sure that's going to get me a hate crime accusation somehow.
Heather, last questions. Affirmative action. The Supreme Court's ruling in the 2003 case, Grutter versus Bollinger, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, now long retired, but she wrote for the majority in that case, quote, "The court expects that 25 years from now, the use of racial preferences will no longer be necessary." Now that we're more than halfway through that 25-year period, do you see any sign that universities are backing away from the use of racial preferences?
No, they're fighting tooth and nail to preserve this. The presidents want to feel noblesse oblige, that but for their racial preferences, they wouldn't look out over their marvelously diverse realm. It makes them feel superior to redneck America, that they believe it's composed exclusively of deplorable bigots. And the sad fact is that the driving force behind all of this, which is the academic skills gap between blacks and whites, has not closed. The average black 12th grader still reads at the level of the average white 8th grader. That is really a problem, Peter. And but the solution is not preferences in college. There's got to be a cultural revolution in the black home that puts a priority on education that we see with Asians. They're whooping everybody's ass because they are so single-mindedly focused on academic accomplishment.
Actually, use that. I didn't write it down, but you have in the book, I'll remind you, and then you take us through it, the mind experiment, the thought experiment, rather. Give us that thought experiment.
Well, this is the claim that everything we see today, every racial disparity is the result of discrimination. That's the left-wing explanation for all things in the world is structural inequalities are a result of structural racism. The conservative view, in my experience, is more likely to say behavioral choices, personal responsibility. So I pose this thought experiment. If for 10 years blacks acted like Asians in all things relevant to both academic and economic success, starting at a young age forward, if black children attended school, now the truancy rate is 5 times higher for blacks and for whites, attended school at the same rate of Asians, studied at the same rate of Asians, did not have children out of wedlock, waited until they were married before having children, did not get involved in gangs, crimes, drugs. So they acted like Asians in all things. If after 10 years of that we still saw the racial disparities that we do, then it is time to look for a structural inequality, to look for a ubiquitous racism explanation. But right now, when the behavioral disparities are so glaring and so obvious, it is woefully premature to say that what's going on here is implicit bias or explicit bias.
The diversity delusion on faculty. The professoriate is tongue-tied when it comes to promoting the wonders of its patrimony. These privileged cowards can't even summon the guts to prescribe the coursework that every student must complete in order to be considered educated. Close quote. Why not?
I don't know.
Why not?
I don't know.
To be a tenured faculty member at a major university, even at a small school, is a wonderful way of going through life and should provide the grounds, should provide an ironclad guarantee against the kinds of, they should be the most courageous people in America.
I know.
What's going on?
Peter, maybe you at Dartmouth were wise enough to structure a good curriculum that made sure you were educated in the basics. But when I was in college, I was at a college that had one of the best history departments in the country. Those professors did not have the guts to tell me, you're not getting out of here until you study history. And so I didn't. The students are, the point of college is to cram as much knowledge into the empty noggins of these students as possible. We don't know enough to make the proper curricular choices.
They must be told what matters.
They must be.
No 18-year-old.
They'll stuff their curriculum with as much film courses as they possibly can, if given the discretion. But the faculty have lost the courage of saying Western civilization is the source of liberty, of freedom, of extraordinary accomplishment. They won't say that.
Okay, again, the diversity delusion. Quote, the American founders, again, a longish quotation, but it's wonderful. The American founders drew on an astonishingly wide range of historical sources. They invoked the Greek city-states, the Carolingian dynasty, and the Ottoman Empire in the defense of the Constitution. And they assumed that the new nation's citizens would themselves be versed in history and political philosophy. The citizens would know history. Ignorance of the intellectual trajectory that led to the rule of law and the West's astounding prosperity puts those achievements at risk. Close quote. You are not arguing that the universities have gone mad and that it's a terrible waste. You are arguing that the universities have gone mad and it represents a direct threat to the continuation of this republic.
It certainly does. Not only is the ignorance threatening our ability to understand how fragile and how precious is civil peace and a government restrained by rules. You can look, it's not just something in the past. Every single day around the world you see abuse of power, something the founders understood. This has to be checked. The concept of due process of law, of individual rights, that is unique. It's now been adopted. But the other thing that really scares me, Peter, that the universities are pumping into the body politic is this hateful identity politics. The Democratic primaries, you are going to see the university brought into the political realm, the intersectionality, everybody trying to one-up each other in their victim category. I am so sick of sentences that begin, as a female XYZ, or as a black female XYZ, or even better, as a trans black female XYZ. These are all trivial categories. Being female is not an accomplishment, and it tells you nothing about what is important about me, which is what I know, what I've accomplished, and what my beliefs are.
Heather, why doesn't the market work? We began with an incident at Yale, your alma mater. As you argue, that university is as affected by the diversity delusion as any. What is Yale's acceptance rate? 5%, 5.2, 5.3?
Right.
That is to say, for every place at Yale, 20 students apply.
Right.
Yale's not being made to suffer.
No.
Alums are still giving huge gifts
Yep.
to Yale and
Yep.
to other institutions. I can think of Hillsdale and Grove City, two little colleges in. There are 1,800 institutions in this country. Where's the reaction? Why isn't the market for higher education providing some correction?
I think, sadly, because parents are not so interested in knowledge for its own sake. I wish they were. I think, this is the greatest privilege. They want the prestige of these schools. It turns out, starting with the baby boomer parents that baby boomers purported to be, oh, we're so anti-materialist, we're flower children, we're just going to go to ashrams. They were fanatics for prestige. They wanted their kids into the most exclusive college they could get them into for bragging rights at the cocktail party that their kid's going to Amherst. And right now, it's hard to break that monopoly.
All right. Last question. Two quotations here, both of them from the Diversity Delusion. One comes from the great African-American historian and author, W.E.B. Du Bois. He lived until the 60s, but this is W.E.B. Du Bois writing in 1903. I sit with Shakespeare, and he winces not. Shakespeare doesn't care the color of Du Bois' skin. Across the color line, I move arm in arm with Balzac and Dumas. I summon Aristotle and Aurelius and what soul I will, and they come, all graciously, with no scorn nor condescension. The other quotation, a young student at Columbia University who is talking about a music course. Why did I have to listen to this Mozart? Who is this Mozart, this Haydn, these superior white men? There are no women, no people of color, close quote. What does Heather Mac Donald have to say to that young woman at Columbia?
Well, my heart is broken by both quotes. My heart is broken by the first quote, to think of that man living in America's darkest period of hate that nevertheless understood that ideas were liberating and was willing to claim as his own the Western legacy, as was his right. And my heart is broken by the ignorance of this girl who has been encouraged in that thinking by the bureaucracy, by the faculty. She is destroying the greatest opportunity that a human being ever had, to lose herself in beauty, in greatness, in sublimity. And she's going to carry the hatred that she feels towards Mozart and Haydn, and woe to her, because she is losing an opportunity to come out of herself into a realm of the most noble expression that has ever been granted human beings. But she's going to carry that hatred with her into civil society. And I think, Peter, without sounding apocalyptic or extreme, I think we are playing with fire. We are putting civil peace at jeopardy, because it is impossible to overstate the degree to which students are being taught to hate, not just Western civilization, but each other.
I said that was the last question. I told a lie. I have one more question for you, Heather. I read earlier this petition that was put together when you spoke at Claremont McKenna, and said it was ungrammatically false. Right. Every charge was false, that you're a fascist. Nevertheless, horribly ugly. Mm-hmm. You get there, students pound on the window so that you can barely speak. And if you look at some of the comments, you skim around the web and look at this beautifully researched, beautifully written book, The Diversity Delusion, there are people who are calling you horrible names.
Yeah.
What keeps you at it?
I believe in Western civilization. I believe in these books. If we stop reading them, they die. If we stop reading Trollope and Milton and Shakespeare, they die. It's on us. We have to keep. Education is the passing on of an inheritance from one generation to another, and we have to keep these books alive.
It's on us. Heather Mac Donald, author of The Diversity Delusion, thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter.
For Uncommon Knowledge and the Hoover Institution and Fox Nation, I'm Peter Robinson.
An unfairly discharged Marine with a dark secret. A brilliant intelligence officer recovering from tragedy. This unlikely pair are brought together to stop a deadly Russian plot against the heart of the American system. #1 New York Times best-selling authors Newt Gingrich and Pete Early return with a new series filled with action and intrigue that captures the tensions and divides of America and the world today. Collusion, a novel by Newt Gingrich, available for pre-order on Amazon now.
On this episode of Newt's World, since tax day is tomorrow, I thought I'd devote an episode to some of the hidden taxes we encounter in our everyday lives. We'll look at some of the more outrageous taxes that were enacted to change our behavior. I think you'll be amazed, as I was, at some of the taxes that exist in the United States and how some of them came about. I'm pleased to welcome my guests, Elaine Parker, President of Job Creators Network Foundation, and Grover Norquist, President of Americans for Tax Reform. Elaine Parker has spent years studying the tax system and how complex it is, how strange it is in some places, how invisible it is. And so it's great to have Elaine here helping us look at the hidden tax bills that shape our lives. Elaine, why don't you share with our audience your background, how you got interested in this, and what you've done to have a better understanding of taxes in America?
Thanks, Newt. I am the president of the Job Creators Network Foundation. And at the Job Creators Network Foundation, what we do is educate people on how different policies impact their pocketbooks. Taxes is obviously a huge one. And we all recognize income taxes. We do our taxes every year. We recognize our property taxes, and we recognize sales tax in everything we buy. What we don't see are the hidden taxes in our lives on different products. And what people don't realize is that taxes really run downhill. You can see politicians all the time talking about raising income tax, raising the sales tax, or raising taxes on corporations. And the reality is corporations don't really pay taxes. Those costs are baked into the goods of everything we buy, and they roll downhill to you, to me, to the consumer, to hardworking American families. And so people need to understand that they're really paying those increases in taxes.
Why don't we do it by going through one day in the life of the average American? What one day is like in the life of taxes. So at 7 o'clock in the morning, the first thing you might do is check your cell phone. Tell me about taxes and cell phones.
Cell phones are quite a fun product to talk about because everybody has one nowadays. When you're in the store and you're excited about this new cell phone and the salesman is selling you your package, then you walk out thinking, okay, for $89 a month, I've got unlimited talk, text, and all of those things that we're all doing on a daily basis. When you get your bill, it ends up being tremendously higher than what you thought. And all you think is, where'd that $89 a month go? And if you've got teenagers on top of that, like I do, then you've got multiple charges plus all of those taxes. And it ends up being as much as 16% more on your bill. So you're talking about hundreds of dollars a year on top of what you are already paying. And it gets to be pretty expensive.
What I'm struck with is that almost $1 out of every 5 in the average customer's bill goes to taxes. I think almost nobody knows that. And I noticed that Illinois probably has the highest taxes in the country for wireless, pay over 27%. That means out of every $4, more than one of them is going to the state of Illinois in order for you to have a cell phone.
If you live in Chicago, it's even more expensive. And that's because, if you recall, they put a bid for the Olympics. And so to do that, they actually added an additional tax to the cell phone bill to help support that bid. Well, if you recall, they didn't get the bid. Well, guess what? The temporary tax is still there. So now people are still paying this temporary tax for something the city never got. And that's what's so frustrating with politicians and taxes, is once that tax is there, it's really hard to make it go away.
And then around 7:30, you turn on a morning news show on cable or satellite TV. What kind of taxes hit us at that point?
Cable bills. So cable, it almost seems like you have to be in the top 1% of income earners to afford cable these days. We've actually seen in the last decade, cable bills have really exploded in their costs, but it all has to do with the taxes and the surcharges that are really snuck into our cable bills. And we're paying for things like telecommunications equipment in libraries and schools. And so when you add the average tax onto your cable bill, your basic bill, you're paying anywhere from 10 to 13% more on that cable bill, which makes it understandable why we have all these other non-cable options to watch different types of TV, because cable has become so expensive just as a result of the taxes.
You now have paid taxes on your cell phone. You've paid taxes on your cable. You get in the car to go to work. You stop to fill up your gas tank.
It's just amazing how much the taxes can be and who's getting them, because you've got a lot of different entities with their hand in the cookie jars. Federal taxes are about 18 cents per gallon. But when you start looking at the individual states and what their tax rates are, it varies widely. They can be, on average, you'll see maybe about 27 cents across the country. But when you look at individual states like, say, New York, it's more than 50 cents a gallon. And Pennsylvania, 70 cents a gallon. Such a tremendous amount of money on top of just the cost of a gallon of gas.
Does Pennsylvania have the highest gas tax?
Pennsylvania is probably near the highest. California has got a pretty high tax too.
So you've now paid taxes to use your cell phone. You've paid taxes to use your cable. You've paid taxes to get to work on gasoline. You decide to go to lunch. You go to a local restaurant and you order a hamburger. Talk to me about all the taxes that are now sitting on your lunch plate.
When you look at going to lunch or dinner and ordering a hamburger, the obvious taxes are your sales tax on your meal. But when you think about all the way back to the beginning of where it starts, we've got the farmer who raises the cow, has to pay property taxes on his land, electricity, water. He's got his own income taxes to pay. And then he sells the cow and it goes off to the processing plant. And they have to pay those same exact kind of taxes, but they're also paying payroll taxes to their workers. Then we've got the hamburger meat is transported to a distributor. That trucker pays those taxes, gas taxes that we've just talked about, which are tremendously high by state, and registration fees. And finally, the hamburger makes it to your restaurant that you've gone to and on your plate. And they have to pay all those same taxes that along the lines of those other stops, property, payroll, and income taxes. And all of those taxes add up. They're literally cooked or baked into the cost of your hamburger and makes everything a lot more expensive than it should be.
Talk about the taxes built into happy hour.
So when you go to happy hour and you decide you want to have a drink, if you're going to have liquor, you're going to pay more in taxes than you might beer or wine. Liquor is got tremendous taxes on it. Federal and state governments have their hand in the cookie jar on this one too. They tax spirits at $13.50 a gallon. I don't normally buy spirits by the gallon, so what makes more sense to me is what we all know it as is buying it in fifths. So it's about $2.50 per fifth. And then the state tax on additional taxes that can vary as high as over $7 per fifth. If you go for beer or wine, you're going to save some money because it's not taxed quite as high. If you're spending $10 a week in beer, 40% of that is about what you're paying in taxes.
Coming up, we'll talk about the outrageous taxes that are unique and astonishing and vary state by state and city by city. I mean, one of the things that's clear at the margin is that for different reasons, different legislatures and different city councils pick on different taxes that you would not normally think really mattered. And sometimes it's ideological. I mean, for example, there's now a deep commitment that plastic bags are bad. And so more and more places charge you if you get a plastic bag. There are people who think that they're going to reduce the amount of plastic in the ocean by eliminating coffee cup lids. That's why in Colorado, the coffee cup lid is charged extra because it's actually an environmental tax. A lot of cities are now taxing soft drinks.
They do it under the guise of health consequences to try and change people's behavior. But really what they do is they literally project out, if we implement this tax, we're estimating we'll get this much in revenue, millions and millions of dollars. And many cities calculate that they'll have tens of millions coming in. So they're not expecting people to decrease their usage of the sugary drinks. And I've got a great example of that. Philadelphia passed a soda tax as well, and they had projected millions of dollars in revenue. And lo and behold, the revenue never came, but not because people stopped the behavior or stopped drinking sodas. It's because they looked at soda consumption just over the state line in New Jersey. People were going across the state line to avoid that tax. So it became tax avoidance, not soda avoidance.
I mean, how much of that public health noise do you think is actually just an excuse to raise money?
It's absolutely an excuse to raise money. And the states that are doing it, you see why. They're high-tech states already. And so they're looking for imaginative, new, unique ways to create a stream of revenue. For a state that for California, for a state that is so heavy on the health and trying to change people's behaviors with like a soda tax, they are now taxing fruit bought through vending machines. Let me start with, I didn't know you could buy fruit through a vending machine anywhere. But in California, you're going to pay a 33% tax on it to eat a little healthier.
And I will bet you if you go back in the legislature and look, you will find that the Grocery Store Association was proposing that because it was diverting business away from the grocery store. A great deal of taxation is not about a theory. It's about one group trying to gain a net advantage over another group. And so you end up with these very arcane provisions, but somebody somewhere thought it was useful. They ended up getting it adopted. Can you talk about some of the more outrageous or oddball taxes?
I'm a big bagel fan. I love to eat bagels in the morning. That's when I have my carbs. And in New York, they have an 8-cent bagel cutting tax. But strangely enough, if you don't get your bagel cut, you don't pay the tax.
So if you ask for a raisin bagel that is complete, it's 8 cents cheaper than if you ask them to slice it so they can put the cream cheese on.
So you can save 8 cents if you carry your own bagel cutter.
You have to wonder how they thought that up.
So, Newt, I have some oddball taxes here to talk about. In Florida, eager to get parents to make their kids safer, Florida has exempted youth bicycle helmets, booster seats, and other child restraints from sales taxes. So a little bit of an opposite spin there. So again, working to change people's behavior, which that's probably a little easier to do. In California, they have a high proof tax. If your alcohol is more than 100% proof, the liquor tax doubles, which is pretty amazing. In New Jersey, if you want to own a plush or fuel-thirsty ride, that'll cost you extra. There's a 0.4% surcharge that's levied on cars that cost more than $45,000 or have a combined EPA fuel mileage that averages 19 miles per gallon or below. So pretty amazing what some of these taxes, these oddball taxes that are out there. In California, the marijuana dispensaries have to give equal to 2% of their sales to the poor and the homeless because it's seen as an equity issue. It's not fair that the poor and the homeless are not benefiting from the marijuana as much as the people who are paying for it. Here's another one. In Maine, anyone who grows, purchases, sells, handles, or processes blueberries, they're taxed at a rate of 0.015 cents per pound of the blueberries.
One of my favorites, though, is if you take a tethered hot air balloon ride in Kansas, it's apparently entertainment, and so you pay a 6.5% tax. But if you release the hot air balloon, it's now transportation, and so you're not taxed. So no one should ever go on a tethered balloon ride in Kansas. If you really want to ride in a balloon in Kansas, make sure that they let you go. I was very struck when I learned that the champagne cost 6 times as much as regular wine in terms of taxes in Minnesota, and I can't wait to see my friends out there. And it explains why they all drink beer. But it's just interesting when you think, how did the legislature reach that conclusion?
Another interesting example of a tax is in Pennsylvania, they enacted a temporary tax of 10% on hard liquor back in 1936. It was to help the victims of the Johnstown flood. In 6 years, they had raised $42 million. And it rebuilt the town, and everybody was much happier. But they never ended this temporary tax, and it now accounts for 18% of the cost of every bottle of liquor sold in Pennsylvania. It's just built into the retail cost now, so people really don't know that they're paying it.
The people statewide responding to what was really a catastrophe voluntarily imposed a tax to rebuild the town. And then did nobody ever try to repeal it?
I don't know the history of it, but I do know that just in watching all of the taxes that we see enacted regularly, they don't get repealed.
The next time I go to New York, I'm going to go in and check on if I order the bagel without it being sliced, do I get my 8 cents back? Or should I pay the 8 cents in order to have a sliced bagel with my cream cheese? And just see what the conversation's like. I mean, I'll be curious whether the delicatessen's even aware of it. When we come back, we'll look at the sin taxes. What are they, and do they really have an impact on the choices we make? I'm delighted to have somebody who I've known for many, many years as an activist, a very principled warrior for lower taxes and more freedom, Grover Norquist. When you think about all the different taxes, it used to be true a long time ago that we had sin taxes and that the culture at the time actually meant it. That is, if you were a local Baptist group, charging tax for alcohol made some sense because you thought of it as a sin. Considering the chaos of our current culture, isn't the whole concept of a sin tax kind of nutty?
They demonize a product or a person or a group and then say, now it's okay to tax them because it's just a few. So they picked up on the idea of sin taxes, where let's try and discourage people from drinking too much by having a tax on beer, wine, spirits, and making those higher and higher. Maybe people smoke less if you have taxes on cigarettes. But their real goal in life is clear when in South Carolina, the let's tax cigarette people said, well, let's raise tax on cigarettes. And the governor said, fine. How much would that raise? We'll cut the personal income tax the same amount of money. And all of the advocates of raising taxes on cigarettes to protect children from smoking said, well, we don't like the kids that much. We just wanted the money. We're not interested in raising taxes on cigarettes and cutting the income tax because that would create jobs and maybe people would smoke less. We just wanted the money. We were lying when we said, let's do this because it would help children not smoke cigarettes. So the best way to discover whether somebody really thinks they're fighting sin is to offer to offset their sin tax with income tax cut. And then you find out the people who just wanted the money and thought this was the easiest group to roll.
So you could sort of pit sin taxes against sinless tax cuts.
Frankly, I think the whole challenge with excise taxes is that it's the government too much trying to direct what we're doing. You're even seeing on the question of reducing the prohibition on marijuana, California's got a tax system for marijuana. 40% of the cost of buying cannabis in California will now go to the government. So they'll keep the illegal producers in business because it's too expensive to go through the government program.
Which goes all the way back to the Whiskey Rebellion in the 1790s. The Easterners tried to raise the tax on farm-based corn liquor to the advantage of the big distilleries in the East, who apparently had lobbyists or something. It's amazing that even in the very first term of Washington's presidency, we were already into these games. And it really just came down to, who gets the money. It wasn't any complicated moral cause.
They almost split the country east-west down the Appalachian Mountains with those taxes on the Westerners. And people thought they might go on their own or join France or something else. And then the country divided north-south on the tariff. 1832, South Carolina called out the militia against the tariffs because the North was busy screwing the South with tax structures, tariff structures. Taxes are very dangerous. They divide people. They damage the group that gets taxed. And we need to keep taxation as low as possible, as low as necessary. I think it was Calvin Coolidge who said taxation beyond the necessary functions of government is theft. It gets excessive.
When you have a clearly desirable, either very important or very popular project, you can pass a specific levy to pay for that and people will be pretty happy. So when you're saving the Everglades, virtually everybody in South Florida is willing to pay something because they understand how central the Everglades are to the quality of life for the entire state. And so these things spring up all over the place and become sort of dedicated, how do we get it done? And that happens because the general fund usually is so overdrawn that you couldn't get money out of the Florida general fund to clean up the Everglades because there's no money left. And so that's why they create these special districts and special taxes. But the other thing that happens is you get in a room in a conference committee and you need the money. And you suddenly say, oh, I got it. We'll call this, the really feel good about yourself purple scarf tax. And everybody goes, that's great. That'll work. This is part of why I'm a historian and not a political scientist or a theoretician. I want to know who offered it, what the circumstance was, what the argument was, because it's often very idiosyncratic. I mean, I'm totally fascinated. The other thing that's clear is that once a government has its hand in your pocket for any reason, it doesn't want to take it out because it needs the money. Thank you to my guests, Elaine Parker and Grover Norquist. You can read more about some of the country's most outlandish taxes on our show page at newtsworld.com. Please email me with your comments at newt@newtsworld.com. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.